Once upon a time, for a very large portion of human history, there was no such thing as money. There were no coins, no paper banknotes, no account books, no interest rates. None of the familiar things that govern our lives today existed. And yet people continued to live, formed communities, traded with one another, and built cities. It may sound strange now, but yes, almost everything we do today. But here, it's worth pausing for a moment, because this world was not an easier or fairer place the way we often imagine it today. Quite the opposite. When there was no money, economic relationships were far more exposed, far harsher, and you know what I mean, deeply personal. Because the economy was not a system. The economy was the sum of direct, face-to-face encounters between people. And each of these encounters contained a power relationship, whether obvious or hidden. Without money, value could not be measured. And this turned every exchange into an argument, and every argument into a struggle. Don't look at it with today's mindset. Imagine that you were living in that world. In the pre-monetary world, trade was based on barter. People exchanged what they had for what they needed. Wheat was traded for meat, animals for tools, and spent labor for a place to shelter. On the surface, this seems logical. Even today, some people claim that money ruined everything and that barter is a more human system. But history does not tell romantic stories. History shows us what worked and what collapsed. And the barter system, at a certain point, stopped working. Keep this in mind. In small and closed communities, it functioned for a while, yes. But as populations grew, needs diversified, and societies became more complex, the system clogged very quickly. Because in this structure, producing something was not enough to trade. You also had to encounter the right person at the right time with the right need. Even today, these conditions are difficult. Now imagine that period. Let's make this more concrete. Imagine that you are a farmer living in an ancient settlement. You have worked for months, plowed the land, harvested your crops, and filled your storage. Winter is approaching and you need shoes. You find the shoemaker, but he does not need wheat, he needs meat. You go to the butcher who has meat, but he needs tools. You go to the toolmaker, but at the moment he needs nothing at all. And this is where the system locks up. There is production, there is need, but there is no exchange. The economy stops functioning. What economists today call the double coincidence of wants problem is exactly this. But back then, no one gave it a name. People simply lived with the consequences: hunger, wasted time, and labor gone to waste. As societies grew, this problem deepened further. People began to specialize. Not everyone produced everything anymore. This was the foundation of civilization. But at the same time, it created a serious fracture in the system, because now survival depended on what others produced. And the barter system was not flexible enough to carry this web of dependency. A structure that worked in small communities began to collapse as cities grew. The larger a society became, the slower and more unjust barter grew. But the problem was not only matching, there was a deeper issue: time. In the pre-monetary world, value disappeared over time. Wheat rotted, meat spoiled, fruit vanished. In other words, the labor you spent today did not turn into a guarantee that would protect you tomorrow. Stop and think about this. We are talking about a world where long-term planning was nearly impossible. Thinking 1 year ahead was already a major risk. Planning 5 years ahead was almost meaningless. Today, people think of little else but saving money. Now imagine living in a time like this. That is why in the pre-monetary world, there was no capital accumulation, no concept of investment, and the idea of the future was extremely limited. People survived, but they could not build the future. Value could not be stored. Power could not accumulate. Wealth was temporary, abundance short-lived. Someone who was powerful today could easily be vulnerable tomorrow. This made social relationships extremely tense because everyone was forced to focus on surviving the present. In this environment, the economy was not driven by mathematics, but by psychology. Who was more patient? Who was stronger? Who was more desperate? These determined the price. At the barter table, there was no equality. There was power. That is why the pre-monetary world was not egalitarian, as often imagined, but rather deeply brutal. Over time, people began to realize something. The problem was not production. The problem was that value could not be measured. The same object meant different things to different people. A sheep was life itself to a hungry person, but excess to someone who was full. A tool was indispensable to a craftsman, but a burden to a farmer. That is why every barter was a negotiation, and every negotiation was a struggle. And this is where one of the greatest mental transformations in human history began. People stopped asking, "What can I get with this?" and started asking, "What is this worth?" Don't miss this moment. This question separated value from the object itself. People turned toward things that were more durable, more portable, and more widely accepted. Salt, shells, metals, animals. These were not yet money, but they were laying the foundations of the idea of money. People began to store things not just to trade them, but to use them later. This was the first time humanity gained control over time. Produce today, store value, use it in the future. Civilization accelerated precisely because of this idea. But this came at a cost. Value no longer resided in the object itself, but in collective acceptance. In other words, value stood on belief. As long as that belief lasted, the system worked. When belief was shaken, everything stood ready to collapse. This is exactly why money would later create crises. Here something needs to be said very clearly. Money was not invented to save humanity. It did not emerge as a moral advancement. Money was a practical response to a problem that barter could not solve. It was an emergency solution, and like every emergency solution, it created new problems. Debt, interest, inequality, crises. But those are the subject of another video. Now, one final question. Why did people continue to live in this system for so long when there was no money? The answer is simple, but uncomfortable. Because there was no alternative. Barter was flawed, unjust, and inefficient. But it was the only known path. People usually live not with perfect systems, but with familiar ones. Throughout history, major transformations have often emerged not from need, but from necessity. The pre-monetary world was exactly like this. Everyone felt that the system was not working, but no one knew what could replace it. Value was unclear, trust was limited, and the economy was also politics. The strong made better trades. The weak accepted the terms. Value was determined not by justice, but by the balance of power. This pressure pushed humanity toward the search for a common measure, something that everyone could accept, everyone could understand, and everyone could carry into tomorrow. That is how the idea of money emerged, not as an invention, but as a necessity. But this necessity also gave people, for the first time, the power to assign real value to something with no inherent value. This was an immense power, and at the same time, a dangerous one. because this power rested entirely on trust. And trust, as history has shown many times, is one of the fastest things to collapse. This is how the world worked before money: slow, harsh, inefficient, and brutal. Money transformed this world, but not without a cost. To understand what that cost was, in the next step we need to examine much more closely why money emerged and why the barter system became unsustainable.